Hi, y'all, and welcome back to the VisX Show, a barefoot podcast with a Gen X tilt. I'm Vis, and yes, I'm not wearing any shoes. Today, we are diving into a topic that's been weighing heavily on my mind. Finitude. That's right. The idea that our lives are finite, limited, and shorter than we'd like to imagine. It might sound like a heavy topic for a regular show, but stick with me because understanding this concept might just change how you spend the rest of your day. Maybe even your life. This week has been particularly interesting for me because I started a new job. As you might have noticed, this episode didn't come out on Friday like usual. That's not an accident. It's actually a perfect example of what we're going to talk about today. When our time becomes more constrained, we have to make choices about what matters the most. In this episode, we're going to explore the concept of finitude from several angles. We'll talk about how our limited time shapes our choices, our relationships, and even our sense of self. I'll be sharing some pretty eye-opening maths from a letter I wrote to my daughter after her graduation last May. Numbers that really put into perspective just how precious our time is. We'll also dive into how the digital age has changed our relationship with time, and I'll share some personal stories about my own struggles with managing finite resources in a seemingly infinite world. So grab your favorite beverage, find a comfortable spot, and let's dive into this exploration of life's limits and how understanding them might actually help us live more fully. So let's start by breaking down what we mean by finitude. It's simply defined by the state of having limits or bounds, so the opposite of infinite. Now, that might seem obvious, right? Of course, we have limits, but here's the thing. While we intellectually understand that we're finite beings, we often live as if we're not. Think about your average day. How many times do you say, "I'll do that later," or "there's always tomorrow"? I know I do it constantly. We treat time like it's an infinite resource, but it's actually the most finite resource we have. We can always make more money, we can usually get more stuff, but we can't make more time. I've been thinking about this a lot lately, especially with starting a new job. I'm about to overshare. So, for the past 11 years, you heard that right, 11 years, I've been playing an online game called Clash of Clans. What's more is that I'm currently the clan leader. Now, some of you might be thinking, really? You're talking about a mobile game? But stay with me because this is actually a perfect example of how we deal with finite resources. See, being a clan leader isn't just playing a game. Over those 11 years, I've built real relationships with people in the clan. We've celebrated birthdays together, births of new babies, grandbabies. We've supported each other through tough times, shared life milestones. These are real connections with real people. But now, with my new job and my other commitments, I'm stepping down from leadership. And here's where it gets interesting. See, this decision isn't about choosing between something valuable and something worthless, although arguments could be made. It's about choosing between multiple things that have real value. That's the real challenge of finitude. It's not about saying no to the bad stuff. That's easy. Anybody can do that. It's about saying no to good things so you can say yes to better things. This is especially hard because of FOMO, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. You know, when I was younger, I used to think that, which we'll talk more about later. When I was younger, I used to think that being an adult meant having the freedom to do whatever you want. But I've learned that being an adult actually means having the wisdom to understand that you can't do everything you want. You have to choose. And those choices, they're not just about how you spend your time, they're about who you become. Let me give you another example. When I was writing that letter to my daughter for her graduation, I did some math about time. Let me tell you, these numbers changed how I think about almost everything. Would you like to hear them? Because they might change how you think about things too. All right, so let's talk about numbers. When I was writing the graduation letter to Gloria, I started doing the calculations that honestly stopped me in my tracks. You might want to sit down for this, or if you're driving, just grip the steering wheel a little bit tighter. So as of May 2024, Gloria had lived at home with us for exactly 6,578 days. That sounds like a lot, right? Just over 18 years worth of days. But here's where it gets interesting and a little bit heartbreaking. If she spends 10 days a year with me after she leaves for college and does that consistently for the next 40 years, that adds up to 400 days. Just 400. Compared to 6,578, that's only 6.1% of the time we've already had together. There's not much left. So let that sink in for a moment. All those future Christmases, Thanksgivings, summer visits, they'll only add up to about 6% of the time we've already shared. And you know what? That 10 days a year, that's maybe being optimistic on average. Between work schedules, other commitments, and life just getting in the way, even getting those 10 days can be a challenge. But wait, it gets more interesting when we look at siblings. If Gloria spends those same 10 days a year with her brothers and sisters for the next 70 years, and let's be honest, 70 is being really optimistic, that's 700 days. Sounds better than 400, right? But it's still only 10.6% of the time she spent at home with them under the same roof. Now, let's talk about school friends, because this one's really hard. It blew my mind. During her time at school, Gloria spent about 18,000 hours of instruction time with her classmates. That's not counting sports, extracurricular activities, or hanging out after school, just pure classroom time. If she spends 3 hours a year with each of those friends for the next 50 years, which again is generous, that's less than 1% of the time they've already spent together. These numbers aren't meant to depress us. They're meant to wake us up, because here's the thing. We often live as if we have infinite time with the people we love. We postpone phone calls. We skip visits. We say we'll catch up soon, without really meaning it. We treat time like it's an endless resource, but these numbers tell us a different story. In our modern world, we have the illusion of constant connection. We see people's Instagram stories, we like their Facebook posts, we send them emoji reactions on their updates, and it feels like we're staying in touch, right? But are we really? Let's talk about how technology has changed our relationship with time and connection. So speaking of technology, let's dive into how the digital world has completely transformed our relationship with time and attention. And I want to start with a confession. I'm just as caught up in this as anyone else. The other night, I was sitting in bed with my wife, supposedly watching a show together, but here's what was actually happening. I was kind of watching the show, kind of scrolling my phone, and I looked over and she was doing the same thing. We were physically in the same space, but were we really together? This is what you might call adjacent time rather than shared time. It's become incredibly common in our digital age. It's fascinating how social media and digital content have created relationship mirages. Let me explain what I mean. So think about your favorite YouTuber or podcast host, not me, someone actually famous, but you probably know their mannerisms, their catchphrases, their personal stories. Maybe you even know their kids' names or what they had for breakfast. It creates this feeling of intimacy, doesn't it? But it's completely one-sided. Here's a mind-bending thought. There are content creators out there who have never met most of their audience, but have influenced their lives more than some of their audience's actual friends. That's not necessarily bad, but it's something we need to be aware of, because these parasocial relationships, evidently that's what psychologists call them, they're taking up space in our finite attention budget. Let's talk about the attention budget, because this is crucial. Just like artificial intelligence uses tokens to process information, We humans have a limited number of attention tokens that we can spend each day, or a limited number of tokens that we can spend at a given time at the same time. Every notification, every scroll, every video, they're all spending these tokens. And once they're spent, they're gone. You can't get them back. This brings us to the concept of the attention economy. Now, you may have heard the saying, if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. But I want to take that a step further. Even when you are paying for the product, your attention is still being monetized. Think about streaming services. You pay for Netflix, right? More and more every year. But they're still competing for your attention, still trying to keep you watching just one more episode. I grew up in Generation X, and we were the last generation to experience life without this constant digital intrusion. I remember getting a VHS player was a big deal. We might have even rented the VCR along with the movie. Can you imagine explaining that to kids today? But here's what's really interesting about being a Gen Xer. We have this unique perspective because we lived in both worlds. We remember what it was like before all this technology, but we've also embraced it. I mean, here I am recording a podcast, probably being listened to by someone who's simultaneously checking their email. You see something at any restaurant that will drive this home. There will be a family of 4 or a group all sitting together, and every single one of them will be looking at their phone. They were sharing a meal, but not really sharing time, and it makes me think about something my kids' school suggests. I'm really fortunate to have my kids attend a school that addresses digital pitfalls and the importance of the IRL, the in real life relationships. What they suggest, they call it hang up and hang out. It's such a simple concept, but it's surprisingly powerful. For instance, when the kids go out to eat together, they can put all their phones in a pile in the middle of the table. And they've been taught the first person to reach for their phone has to pay the bill. That's a real consequence. Now, you might think teenagers would never go for this, but here's what's fascinating. They love it. It turns out, deep down, most of us are craving real, undistracted connection. This is where being a Gen Xer gives me an interesting perspective. See, when I was a kid, our parents, not mine specifically, but I knew ones who would literally lock us outside. I'm not exaggerating. They would actually lock the door and tell us to come back when the streetlights came on or when the sun was going down for us country kids who didn't have streetlights. We'd spend hours climbing trees, catching tadpoles, and all sorts of fun things like trying to dig to China through our Texas backyard. Spoiler alert, we never made it through that first rock layer. But here's where it gets interesting about those memories. They were completely undistracted. We weren't checking our phones every 5 minutes. Most of us didn't even wear a watch. We weren't thinking about what this would look like on Instagram. We were just present, fully present in whatever ridiculous adventure we were having. So this brings me back to the letter I wrote to Gloria. In it, I shared 3 things that I hope she'll prioritize in her life as she decides how to spend her tokens. They're really things to use as a lens to focus how we should think about prioritizing our time and attention. These 3 things that I want most for all of my children, and regardless of any of their other choices, I feel like this will equal success. The first one is knowing Christ and having a deep, meaningful relationship with Him. Second priority is to be kind. This isn't just about being nice, it's about intentional kindness. I make it a point to learn the names of every server at a restaurant, every barista at my coffee shop, every person who helps me in any way. It takes seconds, but it acknowledges their humanity. It says, I see you as a person, not just someone serving me. And you know what's interesting? In our digital age, we often think we're being kind by liking someone's post or sending them an emoji. And those things aren't bad, but they're not the same as looking someone in the eye and really seeing them. Real kindness takes time. It takes presence. It takes intention. The third priority is being productive, but not in the way you might think. I'm not talking about hustling 24/7 or maximizing every second of every day. I'm talking about adding value to your communities. And notice I said communities plural, because we all belong to multiple communities, our families, our churches, our neighborhoods, our workplace, the world at large. For example, I used to have a little old lady that lived right next door to me. She was an absolute sweetheart. The problem was she didn't have anyone to help her with her yard. She only had a single daughter who also had a daughter, so there was nobody that felt empowered to mow her grass and keep things looking nice, which was an absolute tragedy because I had heard stories about how their yard was once the envy of the neighborhood back when her husband was alive and taking care of it. Now, I could have sent a nice message offering help or posted about it on our neighborhood Facebook group or Nextdoor app. Instead, I just showed up one Saturday morning with my lawnmower, spent about 3 hours helping him get things under control, and then I kept taking care of it until she passed a couple of years later. Was that the most efficient use of my time? Probably not, but it was productive in a way that really matters. This brings me to something really important about finitude that I don't think we talk about enough. FOMO. That fear of missing out. In that letter to Gloria, I wrote about this specifically because it's something every young person struggles with, but honestly, we all do. So let's talk about FOMO for a minute because it's directly related to our struggle with finitude. When you really understand that time is finite, you have to accept that you're going to miss out on things. There's no way around it. You can't be at two places at once. You can't live multiple lives simultaneously. Although sometimes social media makes us feel like we should be able to. I'll give you a personal example. My wife and I were the first in our families to start having kids. Before kids, it was easy to make it to multiple family gatherings on each side of the family for every holiday. After having kids, it really became impractical and maybe unwise to try and make every gathering, so we had to choose. Choose between gatherings, both that we would love to be at. One with my side of the family, one with my wife's side. Both were important. Both would have been meaningful. But I couldn't split myself in half, right? And here's the thing, whichever one I chose, I was going to miss out on something special at the other one. We navigated by prioritizing one family each year for Thanksgiving and the other family for Christmas on the same year, and then switching the next year. The key is learning to be at peace with these choices, understanding that missing out isn't a failure. It's just a natural consequence of being finite beings in a world of infinite possibilities. You know what I've noticed? The more we try to avoid missing out, honestly, the more we end up missing what's right in front of us. It's like we're so worried about what we might be missing elsewhere that we miss the beauty of where we actually are. So this reminds me of something I've been thinking about lately with my Clash of Clans situation. So about this Clash of Clans situation, it's actually taught me something profound about FOMO and finitude. I'm not the first leader to step back or stop playing the game. Many others have, and many others will as well. The last leader hardly logs on anymore, but we're very close in real life. He made a choice between two things he likes. It makes me realize we're all dealing with the same choices, the same limitations. And sometimes just being honest about our limits gives other people around us permission to acknowledge their own. The Clash of Clans was never the problem. It was my resistance to accepting my own finitude, my own limitations, that was creating the internal tension. I was trying to be a full-time employee, a present father, a podcast host, and a dedicated clan leader. Something had to give. And that's okay. That's not failure. That's wisdom. Now, you might be wondering what all of this has to do with being barefoot. After all, this is a Barefoot podcast. Well, let me tell you about an experience I had yesterday that ties this all together. I was feeling a little overwhelmed with all these thoughts about finitude, time, lack of time. So I went out to my backyard, took off my shoes. I just stood there in the grass. The sun was shining down warmly on my face and shoulders, and something interesting happened. When you're barefoot, you can't help but be present. I felt every blade of grass. I could feel the damp spots between the grass blades, the little temperature variances, every texture under my feet. You know what you don't feel when you're barefoot? FOMO. You don't worry about what's happening on Instagram or what you might be missing at some other event. You're just there, present, grounded. Literally and figuratively, actually. Our feet have these incredible sensors that connect us to the earth, to the present moment. But we spend so much time with our feet covered, like they're in foot coffins, dead to their surroundings. Just like we spend so much time with our attention covered by layers of digital distraction. So what do we do with all of this? How do we live well within our limits? I want to share some practical steps that I implement in my own life, and maybe they'll resonate with you too. First, I love D&D. Not Dungeons and Dragons, the good old do not disturb function on my phone. When I'm with someone, my phone goes in my pocket, not on the table, not face down in my pocket. At these times, D&D is better than vibrate. Put it away. Even having it visible creates what researchers call attention residue. Part of your brain is always aware it's there, waiting for that notification. Second, I'm being more honest about my limits. When someone asks me to do something, I've stopped saying I don't have time. Instead, I say, that's not where I'm choosing to spend my time right now. Because that's more honest, isn't it? We all have the same 24 hours. It's about choices. Third, I'm trying to make more space for what I call barefoot moments, times when I'm fully present, fully grounded in whatever I'm doing. Whether that's actually being barefoot in my backyard or just giving my full attention to a conversation with my kids at the dinner table. Remember those numbers from Gloria's letter? The 400 days we might get with our kids after they leave home? I want those to be full days, not days where we're physically together but mentally elsewhere. As we wrap up today's episode, I want to leave you with one final thought. Understanding our finitude isn't about living in fear of time running out. It's about saturating our mortality, living with intention because we understand that time is precious. Here's something beautiful about limits. They force us to choose what really matters. They make us appreciate what we have. They remind us that every moment is a gift, not a guarantee. In the letter to Gloria, I wrote that these numbers weren't meant to make her sad, but to make her intentional. And that's my hope for all of us, that understanding finitude doesn't paralyze us with fear, but motivates us to live more fully, love more deeply, and choose more wisely. So before I go, I want to thank you for spending some of your finite time with me today. If you found this episode meaningful, please share it with someone you care about. I'd love for you to let me know your thoughts, and the platform that you're listening to would love it if you would like and subscribe. And maybe, just maybe, take your shoes off for a few minutes today. Feel the ground beneath your feet. Remember that you're here, now, in this moment.